I'd just like to introduce, this is Tom Luhring, did I say that right?
Yeah, that's fine.
And he's going to give the presentation tonight, and he's an MSU researcher, and turn it over to you.
Yeah, sure.
Cool. All right, well, thanks for having me. So my research, I'm going to talk about what we worked on in Deer Creek, just upstream up here. It's actually part of a larger project to understand how we can change sea lamprey migratory behavior in a way that helps us control them more effectively, to ultimately be able to treat fewer streams with pesticides, as well as not have to spend that money and time and man effort into treating 300 to 400 streams throughout the Great Lakes. If we can really narrow it down to just a few streams that we're really good at treating, then we'd be accomplishing a lot as far as reducing the amount of pesticide as well as the amount of money we'd have to spend. But the way we get to that is to kind of take you through the sea lamprey life cycle. The larvae live in streams for anywhere from 2 to 6 years, usually around 4 years or so. And they're producing chemicals that essentially kind of announce their presence to adults. And then during the spawning season, the adults are moving upstream, so they're coming from the open lakes, they're coming into the rivers trying to find the right tributary to breed in, to spawn. And they're like salmon, they spawn once and then they die. So there's a lot kind of riding on this decision for them to try to find the right stream at the right place where there's mates and everything. So they do that by picking up a lot of scents. So they have a very strong olfactory system, so they have a very strong sense of smell. The alarm cue that we use to try to manipulate them, we're only using it about 1 part per million in the stream, so a very small amount. So you're talking a drop inside a bucket of water or a 13-gallon aquarium. So very small concentrations they can pick up, and that gives them information about the system they're in. They can pick up the larval odor at even lower concentrations. So they're able to tell that there's larvae upstream just from the sort of waste products and other sort of scents that they're putting out. And that tells them, okay, this place has been good in the past for larvae to develop, and so it's probably going to be a good place for me to breed because my offspring will be able to succeed there as well. So what we're trying to do with these scents is basically we've developed something called alarm cue. Essentially, we boil the lamprey in ethanol, dead lamprey. We're boiling these dead lamprey from the previous season's spawning run in ethanol, and that extracts sort of the smell of dead lamprey off of them. And then we evaporate the ethanol off of that, and that just sort of concentrates all of this dead lamprey stink, if you will. Or we call it alarm cue. It's a little bit easier to say than dead lamprey stink. So what we do is then we use this and we mix it in with river water and carboys, and then we have pumps that we can modulate according to water flow in the stream, and then we can reach the desired concentration of alarm cue that we want to pump into the stream. So really it's just the washings off these dead lamprey that we're using to hopefully repel them. And if you put lamprey in a stream and you give them sort of a right side of the stream, left side of the stream, so we'll just use these tables as an example, and just say, you put a barrier right in the middle of the stream, and you pump alarm cue down this side, and there's no larvae in the stream or anything, there's no other scents that are really kind of guiding them where to go, they'll almost 100% go up the right-hand side. And we're doing this in concentrations of 10 million parts water per 1 part alarm cue, and they were still almost completely avoiding it. And so very high concentration. We usually use about 1 part per million when we're running our tests, just because we've also seen that there's some variation in how strongly they respond to things according to the concentration. So what we did last year is in Carp Lake River Outlet, we're trying to see if we can take the whole stream where it comes into the lake and block it off from sea lamprey migrations completely. And so the thing to keep in mind is these are animals that they have a short time to breed. They have the breeding season to breed at one time, or they're going to die anyway. So they have a really strong motivation to move upstream and to breed just like salmon do. So the thought is, well, can we block off a whole river where it comes into the lake and actually keep them from breeding anywhere in that watershed? And in short, the answer was no. They still moved upstream, but what we found is that they actually move upstream faster. And if you have a barrier at the top, like they do at the Carp Lake River Outlet where we did last year, more of them get caught in that trap that are moving up from the lake. So you're actually increasing your trapping efficiency because they keep moving to try to get past this sort of really bad smell of dead animals. It's, you know, like if you had a tear gas canister or something go off in a movie theater by the exit door. People are still going to move through that exit door to get out of that area. You're not going to keep them from moving up the one pathway that they're going to be trying to get out of. So that's been used this year in a modified a modified proposal to see if we can actually kind of push them upstream towards the trap, and also away from one half of that stream, and then push them over to the other side of the stream where there's actually a trap. And so that's what they did on Carp Lake River this last year. They're still going through the results of those. Preliminary analysis of just very kind of quick back of the envelope sort of thing. It looked like it was working pretty well. I wasn't running that project, so I can't say exactly. I'm kind of excited to see how it worked out. But it sounded like it was working pretty well. The project that we're doing on the East Jordan is we're trying to see, or project on the Jordan, we're in East Jordan. So the project we're doing on the Jordan River where Deer Creek comes in is we're trying to see if, well, can we block off this one tributary of the Jordan River and try to get them to move up the Jordan River instead of up Deer Creek. Every year they generally have at least a small run going up Deer Creek. There's larvae, sea lamprey larvae present there. Actually this year they're treating the entire Deer Creek for the sea lamprey larvae to try to wipe them out. So we're trying to see, well, can we block off this whole branch? So that's the next part you move up in the tributary. So we know we can keep them on one side of the stream or the other. So if you're going to put a sort of an intercept trap in there somewhere, you know, that might work for places without barriers. The other approach is, well, can we block off and move them into certain tributaries? And we don't have all the data yet from this. This is data that comes down onto a little computer, and then you have to upload all the data from that, sort it out, format it, and everything. But the short of it is that they still move up. I still have to figure out if they're moving up in less numbers or not. But they're still kind of moving up that river branch. The problem with this year is we're also really delayed. So we had the really long, cold winter. Sea lamprey have sort of different behavioral modes and sort of development modes that they go through. So they're coming in from the lakes. They've gorged themselves on fish. In a single year, they've grown from a little tiny parasite that's attached to the side of a fish to a big full-grown adult that's moving upstream to breed. And so they're in this migratory phase that's coming up into the rivers. And then after they've come up the rivers and they got into a little bit warmer water, they start to mature into their spawning phase. They don't really respond to alarm cue in the same way. And so what we're wondering is if this past year with the really long delay, they are held out in sort of the mouths of these rivers, just waiting for the temperature to warm up finally, and the years, the days, weeks are passing. The thought is, well, maybe they've matured to the point where they're not really responding to it in the way that we expect them to. As if they were migratory animals, what if they just kind of skipped or at least very much shortened that sort of migratory phase and they're already at that sort of in between spawning phase, or maybe their early teenage years, they're just trying to get past the smell, or they don't even recognize the smell as strongly. We saved a lot of the animals that we ran just so we could go back and look to see how well developed they were, to see if that's actually the case, or the truth may be, well, they'll move upstream. In the presence of it, they're just going to try to get by. They have a short time to breed, and you give them this sort of scent that may indicate a predator's there, or if there's bad habitat upstream somewhere, they're just probably going to try to punch through it. And so the better application of it may be, again, we still have to kind of tease out what exactly happened this year, how mature they were, but the better application may be trying that sort of left side, right side application where you're actually getting them to move on one side or the other within a stream. And so then after Deer Creek, we went up to the UP up near Manistee. Off the Manistee River, there's a creek called Stutz Creek, and there's two places where the creek branches off into the south branch and the middle branch. And we were testing to see, well, can we get them to pick a stream branch, left branch versus right branch. So just kind of moving upstream to try to see, at what point in this system can you actually potentially manipulate them to go to one side or the other. We know we can, if they're in a stream, we know we can get them to go left side or the right side. And that's in a stream without any sort of background cues. Stutz Creek had larvae upstream on both sides, which would indicate to them that there's good habitat up there somewhere. And they did go up both sides and there's alarm cue present. So it may be something where you have to wipe out the larvae first, but once you wipe out the larvae, that attractive scent's gone, and maybe at that point you can actually tell them to go to the right side or the left side. But again, this is still, we're trying to figure out how exactly this works. It did look like we were kind of changing their behavior a little bit as far as the timing at which they move up, their timing at which branch they choose. So there is some sort of behavioral modification that's going on. We just have to figure out the best way to kind of use it to our advantage. Or as Dr. Wagner calls it, I think he called it, is it a scent with modification? You know, they're moving upstream, we're trying to modify how they're moving upstream. But I mean, that's basically where we stand now with all that. Just trying to figure out the best way to push them to one side, pull them from the other side. We use pheromone and larval odor as our pull to try to attract them to things, and we know that we can attract them with that. And then the push, the alarm cue, it does change their behavior. They'll move upstream faster to try to get out of it. We know they're not attracted to it because if you give them sort of a left side of the stream versus right side of the stream, they'll always choose the side that doesn't have the alarm cue on it. It's just trying to figure out where sort of in the system you apply this technique to have it to be the most effective. And that's one of the things that we're still working on.
So how long is the breeding system or season?
I mean, it depends on the year, and so the thing is, it starts out in the south a little bit earlier. So the Betsy and other rivers will, because they're warmer earlier, and then as you move up to like Carp Lake River Outlet, the far north part of Michigan or the Lower Peninsula, and then you move up to Manistee River, and then you go up to a lot of rivers, and Lake Superior is a little bit later. So like St. Mary's, they were just starting to get some of their animals earlier. Well, and they're probably getting their sort of the first trickle of their runs in late June, and so we got some of the first animals that they had coming in. First animals that we were able to get a hold of when we were actually situated in East Jordan. We actually didn't get animals here until we're talking end of May, and we actually rented a house for all of May. And then, so we're getting towards the end of May, we're like, hey, we're going to get any animals coming in yet? Be nice to get some animals before we get kicked out of the house we rented. But luckily, we found a place down the road, Bell's Cabins. They gave us a pretty good rate for 10 days to stay there. And so me and one of the other guys, Ryan Taylor, were bunked up in this little, and he had the futon, I had the bed, and then the little efficiency kitchen and everything. So,
but how, you said the breeding season is brief.
Yeah. So it depends on how quickly the water warms up. So it is somewhat temperature dependent. So once they get to a really warm temperature, they really just start maturing really quickly. You can take an animal that's been really cold, but as soon as you move it somewhere where it's really warm, they can mature pretty quickly as a matter of a few days. And then once they breed, they're spent, especially the females, once they breed, they deposit their eggs, they're spent. The males can probably breed a few times, but it's sort of this like the salmon. They spend all of their energy into breeding. A female can lay a couple 100,000 eggs. So a single female making it into a branch, and you have to treat that branch after she's mated because you have a nice established. That's one female making it. So it's one of those things where you have to be really effective, and you really have to nail down how exactly everything is going to work. And it's one of the advantages of, we worked in a goofy year, but there's going to be more goofy years. And so we really have to understand how it's going to work every year across time. And that's the hard thing with scientific studies, is to get people to fund you for, do research on this over 2 decades so you can catch all those little, goofy years in there.
Does that mean you'll be back next year?
Well, there's some other funding that we'll probably be going after. My particular project that I was on, so my project was actually funded by the EPA. I say my project. The project that I'm paid through, that Dr. Wagner got, is actually funded through the EPA. So it's through their Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. And so they were interested in this because, one, we were going to be trying to figure out another way to control sea lamprey populations without the addition of more pesticides to make it more efficient. So anytime you're putting pesticides in the water, it's not the number one approach that you'd want to go with. Unfortunately, it's also the most effective, and really the only one that they've had that's been effective as far as really knocking down sea lamprey populations. because you can't really control them once they're out in the lakes because you're talking about such a large area. So you have to control them when they're in a small area, and the adults come in for that short period of time, and just one adult gets through, and you have a big mess on your hands. So that's why they do that sort of rotating basis throughout the basin. Is they go in, they assess, and they say, okay, we have a large population in the Jordan River on this branch, and then they'll say, okay, well, that's up for treatment in 3 years, and they'll go through and treat that one every so many years. It's just kind of it's like playing whack-a-mole, essentially. So 1 year, and because they don't breed in a natal stream, so they'll breed in whichever river kind of gives off the best signal as they're going in to mate. And so it's the problem is 1 year it's the Betsy, the next year it's the Brule, the next year it's the Rifle, the next year it's Carp Lake River out, the next year, and when you have all of these river basins, and they're struggling to try to get to each one, in time to at least, somewhat minimize the population control. And they've done a really good job with the tools that they have. We're just trying to find a way to hopefully decrease, the branches, if not the rivers, that they have to do that on. Because if you have, the other problem is not all rivers are equally treatable. The TFM, the toxin they put in to knock out the sea lamprey larvae, you have to get the pH just right in the stream. You have to get the concentration just right. And so there's a lot of science and measurement that really goes into getting the concentration just right. And if you're off just little, it's not effective. If you get it just too much, then you might get some other collateral species in there. Stone cats generally don't do so well with TFM. Mud puppies don't do so well with TFM. And I think insects in general also aren't really big fans of it either. So I mean, there's cost to it as well. It's what they use right now because it's the most effective, basically the only tool they have that they know that they can really affect the population. We're just trying to make it a little more effective, and at least to where they don't have to use quite as much. Right now, it's not only the sheer amount of pesticide they use, but also the cost of all of it. I think they spend like 22 million or so a year just on their pesticide and sort of integrative pest management control policy. Yeah, or that's the Great Lakes.
What's TFM stand for?
Oh, I knew someone was going to ask me that. It's a tetrafluoral something. Yeah.
Were they? Yeah, tell me what would happen if you didn't do anything.
If we didn't do anything,
Would there be some sort of a balance that nature would work out where they might coexist in balance? I mean, I think all of these pesticides you're putting in is frightening to me.
Yeah.
And I applaud what you're doing because you're trying to get. Was that your idea?
No.
To
So
make that stinky the dead one?
No. So I mean, it's something that's been kind of known anecdotally, the control agencies for a number of years. Just basically, you have some dead lamprey in a bucket, and you just you throw all your dead lamprey away, and you have the dead lamprey washing. You just kind of throw it out in the stream, and then all the sea lampreys just start shooting out of the water because they're trying to get away from the smell of dead lamprey. It's just this is the first time we've really kind of come up with a rigorous way of continually making the same product that you can apply to try to scare them into one place or another. Like our group in particular. So when I was talking about the TFM and everything, that's how the control program works as far as controlling sea lamprey, and that's the Great Lakes Fisheries Commission as well as U.S. Fish and Wildlife. Fish and Wildlife are the ones that are on the ground actually applying it to get it to work. The GLFC, which is a joint effort between the U.S. and Canada, one of the few instances of really successful binational interactions that the U.S. has with other countries. So they kind of direct the program overall of control, as well as trying to say, well, this is the new research that we need. So a lot of the money that goes into GLFC goes into control, but they also have a certain amount that goes into research, like trying to figure out new ways to control them, alternative ways. If there are ways that they didn't have to pump a costly pesticide that has side effects into the rivers, I'm pretty sure they'd use it. It's just the cost to fisheries is really sort of the big issue. And so the big problem they had with fisheries in the past when sea lamprey first got in, so they got in when we made the canal around Niagara Falls. And so then they were able to circumvent the natural barrier, get into the Great Lakes, their populations exploded. They wiped out lake trout. Lake trout just crashed. I mean, there's a precipitous drop in lake trout populations. And then another invasive species also got in. And then that was the alewives that came in as well. And so then you didn't have these large predators to eat the alewives. The alewife populations did the boom-bust cycle they normally do.
They're gone now, aren't they? They're just gone.
Right, and so
You
that's
never
another...
see them anymore.
Yeah, and so that's the other question is, well, okay, now that the alewives are gone, do we still need to stock salmon to eat all the alewives?
Yeah.
Or, I mean, do we still... Well, now the question is, well, we got salmon, which are a really important fishery animal, even though they're not native to the Great Lakes. Do we need to stock alewives to keep the salmon population healthy? So that's the other question. It's like, now we're just managing invasive species with other invasive species. Or not invasive. I wouldn't say salmon aren't invasive because they aren't really self-populating. It's something they have to be stocked every year. Whereas alewives, they seem to do pretty well unless they have a good predator. And the reason that the alewives have been knocked back down again is because the lake trout population has been doing a lot better. The lake trout population's been doing a lot better because the sea lamprey have been knocked down. And I think the sea lamprey population is around 30% or 40% of its historic population level. So, and it's still lower, but it's still higher than the target that management has as far as their population level that they want. And so there's a lot of adult trapping programs, but the adults aren't trapped for control. The adults are trapped for population estimates. And so they catch as many as they can, and then they release a certain amount that are marked. And so then when they catch the next group, they can see, okay, well, 10 out of these 100 animals are marked. About a tenth of the animals are marked animals that we release versus new animals coming in. And they can actually use population estimates to figure out, well, what's the estimated size of animals in this run? The reason they don't use the barriers and dams and traps for population estimates is because they have really historically abysmal trapping efficiencies. So the other thing that they can calculate from that is, well, we released 10 animals, well, we only caught 3 of those back. That means the other 7 are still out there somewhere. Some traps do really well, like the trap at the Sheboygan Dam in the Sheboygan River does really well. It's mostly because right at the base of the dam they have this big vortex, essentially, that kind of keeps swirling around and around. So sea lamprey are swimming, I didn't go in the trap. Keep swimming, I didn't go in the trap. And eventually on the 100th or so time, they eventually get caught. Even if the trap isn't particularly great for sea lamprey, eventually they'll get caught because they keep coming by it 100 times. Other traps that may not be as efficient, the animal may come in contact with it, may not. They don't get caught, they don't get removed, they breed, then you have all those animals. And that was the nice thing about the alarm cue that we saw last year at Carp Lake River Outlet, is it basically compelled them to keep moving upstream until they're eventually caught and removed.
Cheap to make?
Compared to the pesticide, yeah.
Dead eels in water.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they're not really eels, but...
Or, I mean,
Yeah, it's like sea lamprey, so dead sea lamprey.
Yeah. What'd you say?
How do you keep the how do you keep, when you do one stream, left side, right side, how do you keep the scents on the proper sides?
No, so it's a great question. So the way that water flows is, if you're ever in a stream, and you can kind of try this out when you're in Deer Creek or if you're in the Jordan River, if you kind of, you're stepping in the clay and watch the clay kind of move downstream, as you notice it doesn't move directly over to the right side right away. The other thing you notice is if you do that just upstream of a fork, or a confluence where they come together, is when confluences come together, they don't mix immediately downstream. They actually flow parallel to one another, so they kind of hit and divert each other and keep going for a little while. And eventually they'll kind of bleed together across the stream, but movement is going downstream faster. They're moving downstream faster than they are across the stream. And so in general, those different channels kind of separate and keep separate downstream a good way. I think there's actually a good picture of the Milk. I think it's the Milk River in Montana. It's somewhere in sort of the northwest or north central west. I don't know what you'd call Montana, really. You'd call it the west, but it's kind of northern west. But northwest, you think of Oregon and Washington. So wherever.
Michigan used to be the west.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, there's a good picture of that one, and basically it's where it hits another river, but it's called the Milk River because it's very milky white. And you can actually see where they come together, that they don't mix right away. And so upstream you have these two different colored rivers coming together, and then downstream for a good distance you kind of see them still being separate bodies of water. And so that's why the thought is, well, we could apply it to a confluence like Deer Creek, and then where it comes in and hits the Jordan, you should be able to have these two separate, plumes going downstream, to where you have, the bad-smelling plume, and then you have the good-smelling plume. The problem is the bad-smelling plume also had some good-smelling stuff, because there was a pretty good population of sea lamprey larvae throughout that stream. So the other thing is, from the lamprey's perspective, is, I'm moving upstream. I know there's something good up here. There's also something bad up here, but at the same time, you only have a certain amount of time to make that decision of, am I going to try to wait out this predation event? Or am I just going to try to move upstream and find a place to breed? And when you're kind of faced with that limited time, then maybe it kind of compels the animal. It's like, well, I got to take this risk. Either I take the risk and find a place to breed, and maybe I'll get eaten along the way. Because if I don't take the risk, then I'm just going to die here and not mate anyways, and that's even worse. So
sounds like pretty high functioning thinking process.
Well, it doesn't have to be. So it's just basically, a simple. It's like, okay, if there's something good, then I'm going to swim towards it. If there's nothing good and there's something bad, then that's an easy choice. But if I'm always going to move towards something good, it's just trying to figure out sort of that decision-making process, because there's not a whole lot going on up there. They're not extraordinarily intelligent animals, but that's why we're hoping that we can really manipulate them really well with the chemicals, or at least the scents, to try to see if, okay, you give them a positive, they move towards positive. You give them a negative, they stay away from the negative. You give them a negative and a positive and some mixture or some gradient across the stream, then things get a little more fuzzy, and that's what we have to figure out. So is alarm cue something that we can use in addition to, once they've treated a stream? Once they've treated that stream, they get rid of all the sea lamprey larvae, and there's no longer that sort of positive smell in that stream. Can we block that stream off from subsequent colonization? And that's sort of probably the next natural question to ask. Is, well, it doesn't work at a confluence when you have larvae upstream that they can detect and say, well, that's going to be a good place to breed. But if you've wiped them out in a previous year, if you can keeping them out after you've wiped out the larvae, then you wouldn't have to go back and treat them anytime in the near future. You just, for the sea lamprey spawning run, you just pump a little bit, 1 part per million of the dead sea lamprey smell. The stink, you just stink the stream and then...
Stink the stream, they will be gone.
And keep them away. That would be, that's, we're probably a little ways from, being able to implement that on a larger scale, but, hopefully, there's that part. The other part is actually figuring out what it is in, that scent that, keeps them away. Is it, a steroid? Is it a sulfate? What's the actual chemical structure of that? And can we engineer it? How much does it cost to engineer that? If it's a really big, complex molecule, then it might end up being cheaper just to keep extracting the dead stink off of the sea lamprey. But then if you eventually control the sea lamprey population, you don't have any of those anymore. You still have to figure out a way to make the stink. But
what is a typical, did you say TCM?
TFM?
TFM treatment schedule. And is it granulated or is it a liquid?
Right, so there's two different types. That's a good question. They use a granular balicide, which is sort of like TFM, and that's what they actually use in these big kind of open delta areas, or big open areas where they might be breeding in more of a basin, and they do breed in some of these more big open areas, especially if it's shallow enough for the larvae to be feeding and successful and everything. In the actual streams, it's a liquid that they're pouring in, and they have it pre-measured and everything. And they go and they measure the amount of water moving through the stream, and then they calculate, okay, well, we want to reach a concentration of 2 parts per million or 5 parts per million. I'm not sure what they actually pump it at, but then they actually have their big tank truck that they mix it all in. And then if you've ever seen them on the side of the road somewhere, they have like the big tank on the back of the truck that they're pumping from. But
so a lot of people might be concerned that you were releasing live lamprey into the Jordan.
Yeah. Yep.
But you said each one had a radio frequency tag on it?
Right, so they have what's called a passive integrative transponder tag. So it's the same type of tag that you put in a cat or a dog, right? And so when we had our antennas set up upstream, we could actually detect each time they passed over an antenna, what time they passed over, exactly which lamprey it was. And so we're actually able to detect where they went. The other thing is they're treating the Jordan River, and so if they do breed, they're all going to die. So these are adults that are all going to die. They're no longer feeding. Their only mission left in life is to spawn somewhere and die. And they're treating the whole Jordan River, so basically any animals that successfully make it upstream and breed, it's going to be all for naught because they're just treating the river right after that. So they're treating the river. So we're releasing animals in late May and very early June. They're treating they're treating the stream. I think it was in July. It's this week. Okay, yeah. So they're going to go through and wipe out anything that bred.
I saw a bunch of OME cars and 3 or 4 vehicles up by the hatchery today. Are they participating in some of that right now?
Well, usually it'd be Fish and Wildlife Management.
Yeah, just Canada trucks.
Yeah. Huh.
What is the one you mean?
I'm assuming it was Ontario Ministry of the Environment.
But that's a federal hatchery, so who knows? They could be doing something else joint.
Yeah, well, I'm just wondering if they were here to treat and they're checking out the rest of the stream or not.
Oh no, it'd be Fish and Wildlife. So U.S. Fish and Wildlife are the ones that do that every year. And they have treatment crews. So these are the same people that do it every year. So they have assessment crews, they have treatment crews, and they have the same kind of nucleus of people that do it every year. And then they have seasonal people they hire on every year to work during the season. And so 6 months out of the year they're working on this project, and then the rest of the year they're hoping to get hired on the next year.
Do you do the treatments every 4 years of the TFM? Is that right?
I don't,
Or,
but
but
yeah. So let's run through Fish and Wildlife.
I had a question too. Like, well, we participate in a macroinvertebrate study on the Jordan River. All the rivers in northern Michigan do this.
Oh, cool.
So what can we expect to? How does this TFM affect the macroinvertebrate population?
I'd love to see the data.
Well, we know what they treated the last time. I mean, I don't know off the top of my head because we live on the river and we get letters that say they're going to treat. So that's why they said they're treating from 7:15 to 7:24.
And they have detailed records of where they treated, who treated, how much they added.
So we could go back and look
everything.
at the past year. What I think it was 3 years ago when they
Pretty good correlation.
see if we could we could see if there's a correlation.
Yeah, and it makes for a really great scientific experiment because you have a chronic disturbance that happens every so many periods, and you can look at what it was like before and whether or not it recovers, and see if the species composition changes consistently. I don't know because I don't study invertebrates, and right now I think it's just sort of anecdotal. Like, okay, it seems to wipe out invertebrates or seems not to.
Some mayflies and some of the trichops, maybe some of the black flies are usually gone by then. But it does take out some of them, at least I know those.
Okay. Yeah, but that'd be a really good contribution. Yeah, just getting something out there.
So lamprey is a fish.
Yes, yeah. They're actually one of the most ancient groups of fishes that we still have alive.
So what makes a fish a fish?
A fish? Yeah.
Birds always fine.
Yeah. So so lampreys are, sort of, they're the most basal group, one of the most basal groups of fishes, and they're jawless fish. They don't have scales. They don't have jaws.
Do they have an air bladder or anything like that?
See, I'm not a lamprey biologist either. I've cut open a few.
Here.
I haven't dissected one.
Yeah, I've cut it open.
It's just hard enough to hold them.
Yeah, it's like I don't think they have an air bladder. I'm not sure.
They have gills.
They have gill chambers, so they actually have. That's one of the other cool things is they can actually hold water in these gill chambers to actually exchange oxygen, and so you can actually hold them out of the water for a good bit of time, and they do fine because they can kind of use that water reserved in their gill chambers to breathe.
What kind of predators do they have?
Natural predators are not very well documented, but any fish predators, especially when they're in the streams, they're a lot more vulnerable. I don't know about any natural predators that they have out like in the open water. Probably anything that's an opportunist. Really, anything that's going to swim along and finds one.
I mean, you're talking eagles and osprey and
Yeah, sure.
raccoons.
I imagine. Yeah, turtles will eat them. Water snakes will eat them as well. It's perfect size for a water snake, especially a big one, because it's the same shape as a snake, so it's the perfect, efficient size and shape of the meal.
Do have those.
Yeah.
Kind of joke.
You were just saying that if one got passed, how much does one lamprey produce or spawn? What is?
Right, so a single female can make a couple 100,000 eggs. And that'd be assuming that 100% fertilization. I mean, when you're talking about an animal that fertilizes externally, they're always somewhat inefficient. But still, a female has the potential to instantly colonize a population of almost 250,000 sea lamprey larvae, which sounds like a lot, but they still have to survive the larval period, and then a good bit of those would still make it out into the lake. Which would then be parasites, which would then feed on lake trout and other things out in the open waters. So that's one of the reasons why when they're doing control, they go after the larvae instead of trying to control the adults, is because the adults is just such a high stake game. You have to get almost all of them to really have an effect. And that's another reason why they have a lot of these barriers really low in the watersheds, is to keep them from being able to move upstream farther and have less area to treat.
I got a question concerning the feeding on the lake trout. Now, is it just the lake trout they feed off, or will they feed off any fish species?
They'll feed off other things. Lake trout seem to be so it's a large animal, and they're not going to get very far feeding on a perch. The small ones will.
About salmonoids, if they...
Yeah. Oh yeah. You'll find salmon. You'll find sturgeon. You'll find all sorts of other fish that'll have sort of those big lamprey scars on the side. Lake trout don't do so hot after they've had one of these on there, because it's something that gets pretty big just eating its bodily fluids, and so they don't really do so well. I think sturgeon generally recover pretty well because they're so large, but lake trout is just sort of they're a little bit small to take that much damage to them and still make it.
Are you going to be next year? What are your plans next year then for the Jordan?
So the project that I'm on, this was the final year on that EPA project. They're doing another round for so there was a second grant that we got from EPA last year. So this is the first year, and that's the one where they're working on the push-pull. So they're using the alarm cue in conjunction with attractants like 3-KPZS, which is a synthesized pheromone, as well as larval odor. And so they're using those sort of attractants to try to see if, can we give them a negative and a positive and kind of manipulate their movement that way. That project will be continuing next year, and I think that's the year they're going to be trying to do a kind of open stream. Can we set up a trap on the right-hand side, with no, in a stream that doesn't have a barrier or downstream of a barrier, and then, pump alarm cue on the left-hand side? Can we trap all our animals that way? If we release them downstream, apply that alarm cue on the side without the trap, and then have an attractant on the side of the trap, can we get them all that way? Which would be great, because if it worked really well and you're able to keep repeating that and you're able to do that, then that'd be a way to not have barriers as sort of your main control way to keep out animals. But again, it's still kind of a high risk sort of thing, because all you need is a couple animals to make it past the trap or make it past whatever you have set up to really establish a good population.
Is there ever been a study done without doing it in a stream, but doing it in a controlled area, where you made your own stream, basically where it is sterile, so you can see the cause and effect of it? Or?
Yeah, so that's what we actually have these raceways. It's actually conveniently the size of these two tables together, and that's where we do sort of the assays to figure out, okay, well, how strong does this need to be to get them to avoid it? How consistently do they avoid the left side versus right side? Okay, well, what if we use a different sort of extractant? And so instead of ethanol, what if we use methanol? or what if we use acetate, or a different type of extraction solvent, because it'll dissolve different things, so fats and sterols and sulfates and all these different sort of chemical constituents of the lamprey body might dissolve in different solvents. So then you can say, okay, well, we'll try this one. We've taken the solvent out. Now it's just what was kind of extracted out from that. So if you extract your T-bone steak with Coca-Cola, it kind of gives you a different kind of rinsing out of that than if you do it with orange juice or something else. It's the same type of idea with lamprey. You just have a different solvent, it extracts different things. You take the solvent out, you have what's left. And so we've tested different solvents to see which one kind of extracts it the best, because that would also give us an idea of the chemical nature of what's being extracted out of it. And then you can also take that, and then you can also run that through particular filters that kind of further fine-tune the different parts of that. So you can have things that are in size A, size B, size C, size D, E, F, G, and then you can try each of those in this raceway. So that's what we use the raceways for, is because there's no other signal that they're getting. It's just lake water being pumped through, and they're given a left side versus right side, and we can see, okay, how repellent is this? Okay, fraction A wasn't as repellent as fraction B. Let's take fraction B and further simplify it to see if we can really get that thing. The other answer is it could be a complicated mix of different chemicals. There could be multiple cues in there. So I know when you smell a cake, in someone's window, it isn't just the cake that you're smelling different components of that. You're smelling the butter, the flour, the sugar. There's these multiple, sorry, I'm making everybody hungry now, but there's multiple scents that are kind of overlaying that help to make a picture that tell it there's cake there. But if you just smell butter, okay, butter smells pretty good. If you just give it the smell of flour, then maybe it's not as attractive or repellent in this case. So it could be the same type of idea where you have these complex scents that are giving that message to them they pick up from the environment that they have to have. So I don't know. I mean, it's a long line of work. That's actually my undergrad that's working for me. Had a question. She was here also. She's working on looking at how the larvae respond to alarm cue. So she's probably calling to tell me about her experiment that she's running right now, where she's taking PVC pipes and she's doing what you're talking about, where you have a clean sort of sterile environment. You put sand in there, and so the larvae bury down the sand. They're filter feeders, so they just kind of create like this little divot in the sand, and they have their head run underneath it, and they just filter feed out of the water that's right there. And so at some point in their lives, they start moving downstream. Because if you actually go and you sample from upstream to downstream, you have your smallest, youngest animals upstream, and then the farther you move downstream, you have larger, bigger animals, which makes sense for anything that drifts. So insects, you'll see the same sort of patterns where you have the older animals farther downstream. That's also one of the reasons why insects, when they molt, they fly upstream. Or when they go to breed, they fly upstream, because otherwise they'd eventually get washed out to the sea or the Great Lakes at some point if they kept moving downstream. So a lot of insects have that sort of behavior where they fly upstream. So with the lamprey larvae, she's trying to see, well, can we initiate that sort of drifting behavior? Because if we can and we set traps in the river while they're drifting and you catch them, that might be another efficient way of removing them from the system instead of applying TFM or something else. It might also be another way to sample to see if they're there as well. So there's different applications that we're just trying to see what life stages can we manipulate and what sort of olfactory or sense can we use to actually manipulate those different life stages.
You had mentioned 40% or something like this. That is, it's higher than the target management. It's 40% of what the historic peak had been.
Right.
So what are you all shooting for as far to get it to 15 or 20%? Or?
I forget their exact target, and I can get that for you.
40 way over, or it's close? It seems like 40 is still a lot.
Yeah, 40 is still a lot. So the trapping efficiency that they have is, I think, around the 35 to 40%, and that's how many animals they remove, how many adults they remove from a stream. The historic population level, I think, is closer to 30%. I mean, this is all off the top of my head. I don't remember exactly, but I think it's still about twice as high as their management targets, which is, I think, is closer to 15% of historic highs. And that's basically what they think would bring down things like the lake trout wounding index is one of the sort of things that they estimate. It's also just their estimated kind of commercial cost to fisheries. And so in the Great Lakes, the fisheries are a really big deal because it's a multi-billion-dollar industry that also brings in a lot of tourism, a lot of indirect money coming in as well. So that's sort of their big concern is, well, what is our estimate of, how low do we need to get the sea lamprey population? You're probably not going to be able to extirpate them completely. We're really good at fishing down fish that we want to have around, and then having a ton of fish that we don't want around, like sea lamprey. So yeah, it's really sort of what is the largest tolerable population that we can have, and they haven't reached sort of that low yet consistently.
You said about the wounding, that they wound them. Does the lamprey stay right on that fish until the fish dies then?
A lot of cases, yeah. So the lamprey will stay on until they get big enough to where they're ready to go in and spawn. Okay. And so they're feeding, and they attach and they just start rasping through the side of that fish until they get to a point where they can start sucking out the body fluids. So it's kind of like a really nasty mosquito or tick. I guess it's more like a tick, really.
They have a little beak or something, don't they?
Yeah, they have a really kind of like a file, tongue that they can just kind of sit there and rasp a hole through the side of the fish.
Do the fish ever try to rub them off? Did you ever see that kind of behavior?
So they have really strong grip. So if you ever go to Hammond Bay, this is a plug for going to Hammond Bay. They do public tours, and they walk you through the whole control thing, how they do the control. They walk you through the history of how they figured out how TFM works and why it would be the best chemical control. Because they tested that. They tested a ton of different chemicals to try to figure out which one is the most effective at basically killing the larvae without killing all the other fish and everything else that's of interest in the streams to them. And TFM was the best one they found. That was the most lethal to sea lamprey and the least lethal or least sort of negative effects on other animals that are not targeted in the streams. So it's the best one that they found so far, and it works really well for killing sea lamprey larvae. But they haven't found a better one quite yet.
What about the sterile male project?
Yeah, so they were doing that. That ended a couple years ago. So that ended before I got into, before I came before I came to Michigan to start this project. But it seemed to be, from what I've seen, it looked like it was being effective. I think the problem is so the GLFC, Fish and Wildlife, that whole group gets a limited budget each year. And so they were trying to figure out, well, what's the most cost-effective way of controlling the population? And it looked like it was being effective. So if you aren't familiar with sterile male, basically what they did is, I've been up to the facility, it's actually really impressive. They take all these males that they caught in their traps, male lamprey, and then they'd feed them through this machine that they'd be able to rotate the animal just right and inject it with this particular chemical that basically chemically castrated the sea lamprey. And it would still be fine, it'd behave normally, behave regular, it would give off mating behaviors, and it would attempt to mate with females, but the females that it would mate with, the eggs would not get fertilized, and it'd be just, the female would go out, the female would be spent at that time. She'd blow all her eggs, the male would be there breeding on the nest and attracting other females, and then basically it's a really great idea. The problem is you only need a few males and a few females finding the right males, and you have to knock down the population enough. But it looked like it was effective in creating sort of these dud nests that didn't produce any animals. The problem is you only need a few good males to really kind of mess that up. And I think the conclusion that they came to is that essentially it wasn't worth the cost, because you have to take the money that you put into sterile male, you have to take away from larval control, so you have to take away from people that are going out to put money into the streams, essentially, to knock out the sea lamprey larvae. And as far as the cost per dollar, effect. This is something they're really sensitive to, is trying to figure out the most cost-effective way, and that's eventually kind of became the death knell of sterile male. It's just because it ended up, cost a lot of money. You had to go and catch the animals, bring them all to Hammond Bay, which is between Rogers City and Sheboygan, and then take those animals and then take them back out. And so you have all that transportation cost and then the cost of running the facility, as opposed to throwing that money into putting more TFM or doing more streams more often. So they figured it wasn't as good of a return on investment as the TFM was. But it did seem to be having a decent effect, though.
So do both male and female feed off Electra?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so you can't really tell the difference too well between a male and a female until they start coming in to spawn. But they basically have the same exact life history. From when they are fertilized as an egg, they hatch out, they bury into the sediment in the streams. They stay there for 4 to 6 years, 12 years. It depends on how warm or cold it is, really. So they spend the vast majority of their lives as these little tiny larvae in the sediment, and then once they metamorphose, so they're just like amphibians, they go through this metamorphosis where their skin kind of changes a little bit. Their morphology changes. They kind of go from that filter feeding morphology, mouth shape, to a parasite sort of phenology or kind of body shape. And then they out-migrate from the streams out into the Great Lakes. They attach to a host, and then they go from this little tiny, cute little lamprey into a giant monster that comes in a year and a half or so.
Where are they native to?
So they're native to the Atlantic seaboard. So they came in. So they weren't really imported into the Great Lakes as much as they kind of like, there's this new pathway around this previous giant waterfall that kept us out, and look at this nice, pristine, pure Michigan Great Lakes that we have around here, and they just exploded.
I'm sorry. Weren't they saltwater?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
so they got used to freshwater?
Yeah.
Wow.
So they used to have sort of this life cycle. They still do. So there's still several, out in the Atlantic Ocean. They, actually they're endangered or threatened in a lot of part of Europe. And so, it's always funny when you have them, endangered in one part of
the... Is that because they eat them? Because aren't they considered just
they're a delicacy over there, yeah.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
That's what we should do here.
Well,
make them
Yeah,
that's what John
said. The problem
The
problem with them in the Great Lakes is, we have a lot of, aerial deposition of mercury, atmospheric deposition of mercury from coal-fired power plants and wildfire burning. And so that is, one of the major sources of mercury in the Great Lakes. And then especially colder, deeper lakes like Lake Superior have an even higher concentration. And so, you have this sort of bioaccumulation of the food chain. And so lake trout being the top predator, and then sea lamprey are feeding on the lake trout. And so sea lamprey, like especially in Lake Superior, you can have animals that are more than 10 times higher than the EPA recommended limit for mercury consumption.
In the lamprey.
In the lamprey.
I thought it was a muscle bound. It was in a muscle. It wasn't lipophilic.
Right. So blood can be a major reservoir in fish as well for mercury, as well as it's distributed throughout the animal, but blood is also one of those sort of major reservoirs. And since lamprey are feeding, on the body tissue and fluids and everything, they also take in a lot of that too.
So nobody wants to eat them.
Yeah, I wouldn't advise
Stick it
this.
on your forehead and you got to feed it.
Yeah. And so the lamprey from Lake Erie are actually lower in mercury than lamprey from Lake Superior. Yeah, so when you kind of think like, okay, Lake Erie, I wouldn't want to eat anything out of there, but Lake Superior, pristine and clean. No, actually, aerial deposition, atmospheric deposition of mercury. It's the same problem you have in a lot of these remote, isolated lakes. So if you go and you eat a really big pike out of one of these isolated lakes somewhere up in Canada, you think beautiful, pristine lake that you had to fly into, they can still have really bad mercury concentration just because of sort of a regional problem that we have in using a lot of coal-fired power plants that produce emissions that then aerially deposit mercury into those systems.
So Lake Michigan fish are really bad, just like they've been telling us. They really are high in mercury, aren't they?
Lake Michigan, I think, yeah, so you have different...
Is that like Whitefish Bottom Theater?
Right, so you have different
Right, yeah.
different sources that can kind of feed into that, and you can have industrial sources as well as sort of that regional deposition, and then different characteristics of the basins also affect this. So the type of, whether it's marshland or swampland or forest, or is it conifer forest, is it deciduous forest? All these things can affect sort of how that mercury can kind of, because it has to go from this sort of inorganic form of mercury into what's called methyl mercury, which is the biologically active form of mercury, and it has to be methylated by a particular bacteria, so it has to undergo all these chemical transitions to be biologically available. And so different types of watersheds can sort of kind of exacerbate or ameliorate that sort of process.
That was the big issue when we were looking at the Bay Harbor and the CKD piles was mercury, the problem of mercury being leached out and going into the lake, and it's virtually, you can't filter it out, it doesn't come out easily, and then it bioaccumulates and it gets in the fish, and it's such small amounts, but because it bioaccumulates, it's really dangerous, and so it's really difficult now because we haven't wanted to be really strict in regulation. It's really difficult to find out what fish is okay and what fish isn't, and it's gotten real complex. If you go to the fish advisories, there are columns and columns and columns and columns, what kind of fish it is, how big it is, what time of year it is, what lake it's from.
Yeah.
I mean, really, you can look up different rivers, if you go out to dinner, you better be ready to study for at least an hour.
Stick to potato.
Yeah. Oh,
it used to just say if you were a woman or if you were a child.
I'm eating a potato.
Well, it's something to be really careful with, if you have small children, or my wife and I are expecting our first child, so she's not eating a whole lot of fish right now.
Don't eat
But I mean, it depends on the species, where it's from, and the total quantity, and what stage you're at too. Yeah. So if you're eating the biggest pike, biggest, oldest, nastiest pike you can eat, 5 times a week, then you might have some problems. But I mean, even the standards that are set by EPA they're pretty tight as far as being really low as far as what's advisable. So I think you really have to. I'm a doctor, but I'm not that kind of doctor, so I can't really, say as far as what would be the advisable limit. But I think they're really careful to.
There's always a safety limit or a safety factor included in the calculations too, to account for unknowns, for example, or the variability in the data that you have.
And there's other health benefits of eating fish.
Oh yeah, I think the health benefits probably
So it's
pretty considerably outweigh the negative potential of other things. So you really have to be chowing down on a lot of fish to probably accumulate enough to have
don't
a...
deep fry them, that's the big thing.
Well, actually, that takes PCBs out and probably partition out into the oil.
The chemist could wait.
That's good. Deep fried fish.
Yeah. I mean, that's the problem with mercury, is you can't really get it out of the tissue. It binds differently. It's not lipophilic like a lot of the persistent organic pollutants are.
So they can't get it out of the body once it's in the body. There's nothing that chelates. Is that the word that some things take other things out? It doesn't work to get it out of the body either, the human body?
So one of the things that some animals do, what they're kind of figuring out, is some animals actually take up extra selenium, which they think might be a way to help sort of offset the effects of mercury. But I mean, selenium also in high concentrations can be toxic, so it's, because then you get an animal that has a bunch of mercury, and then it also has a bunch of selenium because it's taken in this sort of other thing to hopefully knock that out. But some animals actually are a lot more resistant or resilient to mercury or methyl mercury in this case. A lot of fish-eating birds in particular, they seem to have adapted pretty well to where they're able to kind of flush out that extra mercury. It's purely speculative, but the paper I was reading about bald eagles is, they're saying, well, we didn't see any correlations between, bald eagle mercury content and nest failures, and they speculated that, well, maybe it's they timed this sort of molting of all their feathers, because feathers also accumulate mercury, and so they kind of timed the molting of their feathers to kind of shed some of that body burden as well. But it's pure speculation.
Well, thank you so much, Doug.
No worries.
That was interesting. Thank you. You can tell you love your job.
Yeah, no, it's fun.
Yeah,
It's fun
it
getting
sounds
into
interesting.
new ideas and.
Sounds fun.